engineer or a software engineer, the topic that we are going to master today is equally important for both of us. So we warmly welcome you all to this event today. And our sole intention is that you will have a lot of information about our topic today. So a little bit about ourselves. I'm Chathuranga. I'm from Sri Lanka, and I'm working as a software development engineer in test at Arvato Financial Solutions in Estonia. Um, and also, I'm an official ambassador of Cypress. Well, a little bit about yourself, Lasitha.
Yes, guys, warmly welcome you all as well. And I'm Lasitha Wijenayake, and I'm also the official Cyprus ambassador, especially on the Sri Lanka and Asia. And yes, my job role is the lead software engineer quality assurance in the company called IFS, and I'm also from Sri Lanka. So and yes, and again we will warmly welcome you session today. And it's yes, it's quite new platform, Bevy. And Chaturanga, do you have anything to add about the platform, Bevy platform? And it will be easy for our
Yeah,
attendees.
yes, of course, Lasita. Like some of you might have already been there in this platform, and most of you might not have. So we will be opening up the Q&A section of the platform now, so that you can raise your questions while on the go. You can just head on to the right pane where you can see the chats, and you can go for the Q&A section, and you can post whatever the questions you have. So we will answer you at the end of the event in the section where we have the Q&As. So the stage is all yours, Jordan.
Thank you guys. Thank you. Uh it's is it evening for you guys? And it's Sri Lanka, right? It's evening?
Yeah,
Yes.
for Sri Lanka, it's 5:30 p.m.
Oh wow. Well, it's early morning here, so I'm drinking some coffee, but it's honor to be with you guys. Thank you guys for having me. Today I am going to talk a little bit about component testing, which is something that is uh, for the most part somewhat new here at Cypress. We've had sort of experimental support for this for a while, but it was never really like a fundamental part of our like product here at Cypress. But back in June, we released 10.0 of Cypress with basically like first class support of component testing. So I wanted to give you guys a little bit more. I wanted to kind of take a deep dive into that. So that's the agenda for today. Hopefully, you guys can see my screen. Okay, perfect. So here is my talk here. Okay, so before we get started, I hate talking about myself, but it's always helpful to know like who's the person like behind the screen talking. So I think I wanted to highlight I'm Jordan. I'm a developer experience engineer here at Cypress. Um, and if you have any questions after the talk or just want to connect with me, feel free to on LinkedIn, on Twitter. I'm at Jordan Powell 88, or you can visit my blog at jordanpowell88.com, and be happy to connect with you guys. Okay, so today's agenda is going to be this. We're going to focus a little bit about sort of the why of component testing. I think it's important before anyone adopts any sort of technology. I think it's important to understand the why and the problems that it solves. And so that's sort of we're going to focus on that in the early part of this. Then I'm going to do a demo so we can get into some more practical applications of it. And then ultimately a Q&A. If any of you guys have questions along the way, please put it in chat. And if for some reason I miss it because I'm focused on the presentation, I'll either come back to it or if any of the other hosts want to interrupt me, that's fine as well. So let's get started with why component testing. So the reason, again, like I said, is we should be very careful before we just say yes to technology, because technology changes quickly. And as an engineer, the most valuable resource that's actually not exclusively to engineers, that's everyone in life. We all have the same amount. And so we want to be good stewards of our time. So the reason why of component testing is, I like to think of it like this. Is so historically we used to do think of development in the terms of pages. So we would think of, I want a home page and I want it to do X, Y, and Z, or I want an about page and I want it to do this and I want it to do that. So we used to build, write our code and build programs based upon pages. And that worked, but there was obviously some challenges with that. And so what we've sort of migrated to over the last probably decade is this notion of components. And with components, we're not just thinking about a page, we're thinking about all the little finite components on a page or in an application. And there's lots of benefits to that, and I'm going to get into that a little bit more. But again, just wanted to highlight, we component testing, we went from pages to thinking about like components. That's sort of the progression we've made. And inevitably, that progression from pages to components has led to this sort of idea of component-driven development. And the reason why is we sort of made this shift is there's several pretty important benefits. One of them is the acceleration and adoption of component-driven development frameworks such as React, Angular, Vue, not to leave out any others, but there's plenty other frameworks out there, front-end frameworks that take this sort of approach where they don't think of your application as pages, but as small chunks or components that end up being basically like put together in a page on the DOM and then presented to the users. So this adoption of those frameworks has sort of it's accelerated and kind of led to this component-driven development. The other notion is that it sort of helps autonomous teams. So teams they're less decoupled from each other, because when you're working on smaller chunks of an application in the forms of components, you can have teams in different teams working on different things, and there's less sort of tripping over each other when you're doing a more component-driven development approach. The other thing is that your code itself is much more scalable and decoupled. So when you're, again, working on smaller chunks of code, you're able to iterate quicker. And so ultimately you're able to scale, and those individual chunks are less likely to be coupled with other parts of your page when you're not even thinking about the page when you're building it, because you're focused on that component and what the individual functionality that it does. And so in theory, really practically, it leads to better architecture because you end up with more scalable, decoupled code. And then that leads to reusability. So if you have a button component per se, buttons are important things. They're pretty much in every application I've ever used. And buttons, they're going to be used maybe hundreds or thousands of times in your application, and maybe not just a single application, maybe multiple applications. And so if you have a component, and the idea of, we've even taken this further and put it into like component libraries, it really enforces reusability. And as well as, once you have reuse, it leads to consistency, because you have the same exact consistent thing being reused everywhere. And so if there's a bug, if there's a new, you need to change the color, a new feature or a bug, you fix it one place and it consistently sort of makes that change across all the instances of that component. And then ultimately improved maintainability, like I just said. It's much easier to fix a bug in one place that affects thousands of places than fixing thousands of places. And so that's where, again, if we focus on code as components, we sort of we kind of box ourselves in, and you sort of get all these benefits as kind of like a side effect. So now that we understand why component driven development, it's important to understand why component testing, because now that we have these components, we need to know like how to test them. And a lot of, and historically, we've always sort of approached this from a, like, we'll just write unit tests, which worked, but there were several downsides to that. And we'll get to some of that in a minute. But when you do component testing, and this is really not, these are not specific to just component testing, but testing in general. But I think it's important to highlight it here with components, because testing provides you documentation out of the box. And so what I mean by that is when you have a component that has maybe certain amount of behaviors, maybe you click a button and an event gets fired, or it takes in props, or it has certain behaviors based upon how the user interacts with it. You would test all those things with component testing. In the end, you get essentially documentation for free, because your tests become documentation for the behaviors and expectations that your component should and should not do. So that's one of the things I love. Obviously, confidence is the ultimate reason why we do testing. So, in the end, when we make a change or we build something new, we want to feel confident when we ship it that it actually is going to work the way we expect it to. The other thing is with component testing specifically, you test that component in isolation, and that's one of the things we're really going to hammer away at here in this talk, and we're going to really demo this later. But the important thing with component testing and specifically is that you're testing your component in the DOM in isolation in a way that we've never really been able to do before. And then ultimately the goal is, besides confidence, we want to feel confident that our users are going to have a good experience in our application. And so ultimately, we want our users to be happy. We want them to continue to use our application, to buy our products, to, whatever our applications do, we want them to have the best experience doing those as possible. Okay, so let's talk about test-driven development. The one thing I want to highlight here is I admit I am historically not the biggest advocate for test-driven development, not because I don't think it's important, but I think sometimes it has become more of like a buzzword or something like we try to obtain in a way that's not necessarily practical. In some instances, test-driven development, when you can do it, I feel like it's great, because it gets you thinking about testing early in the process, and you begin to write code until your test pass. So the idea is that you write a test that fails, and then you write your code after the fact, and then once your code works as expected, your test will pass. That's great. Sometimes when we're building code, we don't know exactly what we're building. We don't know what the code's going to look like. And so sometimes test-driven development is difficult. But I will say that with component testing, I feel like it really enforces this pattern. And that's one of the things that I really want to highlight. And so part of the reason is because when we're building our applications, normally we would say we want to highlight we want to build a new component or update something on our page. Well, normally we'd have to serve up our application and then visit the page that has that thing, or interact with our component or our page to get to the component that we're building or something like that, which is fine, but there's a lot of redundancy and a lot of overkill. And really the only thing we care about is a specific component itself. And so with component testing is you really isolate the thing that you're writing code for, and you just focus on that. And for a lot of people, especially who maybe you're ADD or have a tough time focusing, this can also be a great sort of like hack or something, because it really helps you focus on the one thing that you care about. The other thing I want to highlight is that component testing, I believe, really helps this notion of shifting left. And what I mean by that is there's term that was penned essentially, and the idea is that historically we thought of testing as sort of like this process. And so we would first gather what are the system requirements that we have, then we would gather software requirements, then we would do some type of analysis, then we would basically do a program design, we would then write the code, we would finally test our code to make sure it works before we shipped it and it went to production. Well, the idea of shifting left is like we want to take testing and not be the last thing and shift it left in this diagram so that it becomes something that we think about from the very beginning, even to the point where when we're gathering system requirements and our software requirements in the analysis stage, we're thinking about how are we going to test all those things from the very beginning. And so that's what I like about component testing, is it sort of enforces this pattern. Okay, so finally, the other thing I think it's important to note before we actually get into the demo is that component testing is different from end-to-end testing. And for a lot of you're probably already, I'm just going to assume a lot of you have already used Cypress before. And most of you, that's going to be end-to-end testing. And so though component testing uses the same API as end-to-end, which makes the learning curve for developers very, very small. It's important to understand some of the fundamental differences between end-to-end testing and component testing. So that's what we're going to highlight here. So we're going to talk about what is component testing. First, end-to-end testing, for those of you who don't know, this is just going to be a quick refresher, a technique that where basically we test our apps from the web browser all the way to the back of our applications, hence end-to-end, from one end of our application to the other. And really want to highlight that Cypress runs end-to-end tests the same way users interact with your app, using a real browser, visiting URLs, viewing content, clicking on links, buttons, etc. Testing this way helps ensure that the way you test is the same as your user's experience. So shouldn't be any surprises there, but just want to highlight, and really that's like been Cypress's bread and butter. And so here are some of the benefits of end-to-end testing. It ensures your app is functioning as a cohesive whole, test match the actual user experience itself. It can be written by developers or QA team, and it can be used for integration testing as well. Some things to consider when you're thinking about writing an end-to-end test. End-to-end tests can be more difficult to set up and run and maintain. It usually takes some provisioning of your test infrastructure in CI, and there are certain scenarios that require more setup than others. These are some common scenarios that we use for testing end-to-end. So if you have anything that validates critical workflows like authentication, purchasing, basically the things that you don't want to get a call from your boss at 3 in the morning saying our website isn't working, customers can't give us their money, or we can't collect data, whatever your core functioning business model is, you want to make sure that those critical workflows work. You want to ensure that data is persisted and displayed through multiple screens, or running a smoke test and system checks before deployment. So these, again, just want to highlight these. Not that this is anything new for you guys, but I think it's helpful to compare these two as we focus here on component testing. So component testing is a modern web framework. So modern web frameworks provide ways to write applications by breaking them into smaller logical units called components, what we've been talking about. These components can range from fairly small, like a button, to a more complex component like a registration form. And components test different things from end-to-end tests. Instead of visiting a URL, we pull up an entire app. A component can be mounted and tested on its own. We're going to highlight that a little bit more here in a second. But some of the benefits of component testing, and I want to make sure we highlight these because that's what this talk is specifically on, is that components testing makes it easier to test your components in isolation. And this is, again, one of the main benefits, I think, is you're building or writing tests in isolation, and you don't care about any side effects from any other component or any of the relationships it has with other things. You're only caring about that component in particular. Component testing is fast and reliable, and it's easy to set up specific scenarios and tests. Component testing, I find, is very easy to write them. It's very quick and easy, and they don't rely on external systems to run. So if, for instance, you have a component that makes like an HTTP request, you're not going to want to actually call the API. You're going to want to use Intercept or something like that to fake a response, either via fixture or just get the response status code or body, something like that. And those are things that we'll do here in the demo. But again, just want to highlight that we don't want components to rely on external things. We just want them to focus on the thing itself, the component. Some things to consider are that they don't ensure the overall app quality. So because we're only testing one component at a time, it doesn't ensure that those components play nicely with the other components. And that's why component testing doesn't replace end-to-end testing. It's really like the 1-2 punch, where end-to-end tests make sure all the critical parts interact with each other in isolation or in cohesion together, and component testing basically does the opposite, where it tests all of them in isolation to make sure that they work as expected individually. Again, we do not want to call external APIs or services, and these are written by developers working on the component. So this is something I want to call out. Historically, there's been maybe teams of people, depending upon the structure of your organization and your team. Maybe it was developers that wrote your tests, your Cypress end-to-end tests, or maybe it was like a QA team or a test team. Component test is going to be different because ideally you're going to want your component test to live in your application next to the components themselves. And so typically, and there is a level of framework specific context that you want to have next to for the component. So typically these are going to be written by developers themselves instead of like a QA person. Common scenarios: testing a day picker works through a variety of scenarios that a form shows and hides specific sections based upon inputs, and testing like any component that comes out of a design system. So, okay, here let's compare the two, and then we'll get into a little bit more practical things. But I think it's important to highlight some of the high level the whys before we get into the how. So what's tested end to end? All the app layers, individual components for component testing. End-to-end tests are more comprehensive, but they're slower, more susceptible to flake. Component tests are more specific, quick, and reliable. They're used for verifying that the app works as a cohesive whole versus individual tests, individual components written by, this is something I just mentioned, developers or QA teams. And component test is going to be written by developers or designers, most likely. And CI infrastructure typically takes more for end-to-end and really none for component testing. And then here's the one thing I wanted to highlight. The main difference from like a practical standpoint is when you're doing end-to-end testing, you initialize your test through visiting a URL. So site.visit, your home page, your about page, whatever the entry point for your test is, you initialize that test through visit. Well, we're not with component testing. We're no longer visiting. There is like this notion of a route. It's because it's a component. So we don't visit a route. We mount a component to the DOM, and that becomes the initialization command for component testing. Finally, user journeys. How we used to test, or not used to test, how we test end-to-end is we want to think about user journeys, how a user will take different journeys through our applications to make sure all those parts work together nicely. So for example, we would have like a user search for a product. Then we want to make sure that they add it to the shopping cart, that they enter shipping information, payment information, they complete the order. So with end-to-end testing, we want to make sure that the entire journey through a user works as expected. With component testing, that's not the way we want to think about it. We want to think about it as the individual components along the way. So we want to think about the search bar itself, the shopping cart button, the shipping form, the payment form, the order summary. You get the point. So again, just want to highlight that some of the differences, what we're testing, the benefits, the sort of trade-offs, all those types of things. So let's get started. I'm going to show you, for those of you who are new, we're going to install Cypress. And then the new Cypress 10.0 release came out with a new design UI, which if you guys haven't updated your apps, you should. It looks beautiful. It's faster. It looks great. And it has support for component testing. So now when you open Cypress, you have the option to pick end-to-end testing or component testing. And for those of you, there is breaking changes from previous versions of Cypress, so before 10. And so I wrote a guide on this that I'm happy to share the link at the end. For any of you who are having issues or have questions or concerns about migrating to Cypress 10, have a resource available for you. But let's get to the demo so that way we can talk a little more practically. Okay, let me change my screen. All right, let's see. Hopefully you guys can see this. 1 second. Okay, hopefully this is not too massive, but I can zoom in as much as possible. Okay, so here I have a Angular application. Actually, let me change this real quick. Sorry about that. Okay. Here, hopefully you can see this better if I can find my screen. And if this doesn't, hang on. Where's that? There it is. Okay, so hopefully this works. You guys can see this, but I'm going to open up Cypress using npx Cypress open. In here, we don't have any application. We don't have it configured yet, so we're going to pick component testing. And here's the great thing is that our Launchpad wizard is actually going to detect what dependencies your application has to recommend what framework you want component testing for. So we have Vue 3.2, Vue CLI 3.2, React, Next, Create React App, and we're getting ready to release support for Angular. So I'm actually going to demo that today. And then from here, it'll tell you which dependencies you need to install. In our case, it already, all these are pure dependencies of our application. And so we're good to go. This final screen is going to tell us basically everything that's going to build, which is, this is a new Cypress configuration. So previously it was a cypress.json file. Now it's a Cypress config.ts file or JS. We have a support file, which is going to mount our component, and we'll get into this more specifically. And then we're going to have this is going to be our component index page, which is basically the DOM page that we're going to mount our component to over and over again to do the testing, and then just a fixture which we're skipping. So let me initialize this, and perfect. So I'm going to launch this. And so right now we actually don't have any tests. So let's go right one. Right now this component just has one component. So let's create an app.component.side.ts. So like I said, we have our Cypress folder at the root of our project, but we don't have any intend test because we want our components to live like next to our component test to live next to the components. So here in our actual source code for our application, we have app, and I'm doing the new recommended pattern for component testing in Cypress is app.component, which I spelled wrong. App.component.side.ts. So here we're going to write our test, and we're going to say it can mount. And here we're using side.mount, which is the new initialization command. And here we're going to say we want to mount the app component. And if we press save and click here, let's run our tests. And it's going to give us an error. And the reason why is this component itself uses, it's saying that we have no provider for HTTP client. The reason why is this component itself is it's injecting a login service, which is using Angular's HTTP client. So the way that Angular component testing works is you can add dependencies using this mount configuration. So what we want to do is we need to add an import that is of HTTP client module. And hopefully you guys can see this. So I'm going to save this.
Hello, Jordan. Sorry for the interruption.
Yes.
So could you please bit zoom, because some guys are requesting it's not clear.
Can you see it now? Is it better?
Yeah, it's better than previous. Thank you, Jordan.
Sorry, I have a big screen. You're welcome. Yes. So here we added this dependency, and now this test passes. But this component, right now, this is just an app component. Let's actually create a component, and I want to actually demo. I want to show you what I mean by like component-driven development and sort of how we want to do this with Cypress component testing. So let's actually use the Angular CLI to generate a component called, let's just call it button. And this is going to create a button folder and component here. And inside of this, we're going to make this a button. And inside of it, we're going to do an ng content, which is basically how you do content projection in Angular. And let's go ahead and say it's going to have a click method, and it's going to fire an event of click and emit. This is going to yell at us because we don't have this set up yet in our component class. So let's do that now. And then if I create an output called click and tell it to be a new event emitter, save this, go here. Now this is satisfied. And if I go here to my app component and I reference app button, we now have a button here being mounted. Let's see. And so now let's create a button test. And let's describe button component. Live coding is always great idea. Let's save this and let's go back and reference button component. And here we see we have our button, but you see it, it's like really ugly. There's nothing in it. So one thing I want to note is that this is where, if we just build a new component, and this is where I recommend really leveraging component testing, where you want to build a new component. So you actually go here and you want to build a component, and you want to iteratively go and build, your style. So say we want the padding to be like 15 pixels. We save this. Okay, so now we have, we get quick feedback. Okay, let's change the background color to like red or something. Let's say we don't want a border of none, something like that. Let's do border radius. I don't know. Can't even spell that. Let's see if this works. I don't think it will work. Yeah. But you get the point. So like you can really, let's make color of white. Oops, this is why. So you can really, here we go. 5 pixel art. So now we have a button that looks much better. But as you notice, like nothing's inside of this, right? And so the reason why is we're trying to, we need to do content projection to basically, we pass inside of what we want this thing to look like. So what I mean by that is, here is if I, in this component, I do click me and I save this and go back to our app component test, you see click me is like this, right? So now click me gets displayed inside of there. And button component, if I go here, how do I actually test like doing content projection like that? So what I would recommend is we also have with like React and Vue, you can also use JSX syntax, or like in React, you can do template syntax. So can mount using template. And so what we want to do here is side up mount. And what we want to do is actually mount, like write the actual template, like markdown essentially. So here we want to say login, an app button. And here, if we press save, we need to go here. Now login is displaying inside of here, right? So that's great. But we noticed that we also need to, let's declare this thing. So you see now, we were actually getting an error there before. So by default, the button component itself is, we're basically telling Angular to add this to the test bed. But when you're using template syntax, you have to be explicit for that. So let's go ahead and talk about component properties. Component properties are essentially I can even do this, add typing here. So now the component properties are like the props. In React and Vue, this is, instead of component properties, it's called props. But the idea is you can then essentially reference the properties of the components, whether you pass in a prop or it's an output event. In our case, this component is has a clicked event emitter. So we actually want to validate that actually works, right? So we want to see that it we want to make sure that it emits an event when the button is clicked. So if we side up mount this, we use the class syntax, and then let's do component properties, and then here we get clicked. So there's a couple ways to actually handle this with Angular that I think will be really helpful to show you guys. Is basically the event emitter has, so we're calling the emit method on this clicked property. So we can either do this and do a sci.spy and then create an alias. So like as click, let's do my click button spy, give it a super explicit name. And we're going to have to do as any because the types we're expecting this emit to not be a spy. So we have to basically tell Angular, tell TypeScript that we want to ignore those types for this. And so let's get a button from the screen. Let's click on it. And then now let's get the alias of my click button spy. And we want to assert that it should have been called. So now if we run this test, we see that we click the button and the spy was called and that it was called. But I'm not like super in love with this. It's a little bit clunky. So let me show you another way we can do this. Using create autos or create output spy. So instead of having to do this over and over again, one of the things that we created was this function that we export called create output spy from our Angular mount library or Cypress Angular mount library. And what it does is it will actually create the event emitter and it will also set up the spy on that emit method. So here, all we have to do is give it an alias. So let's give it the exact same. Let's do my click spy so that it's different than this. And you'll see this test will actually fail because it was expecting my click button spy to be called and we have a different name. So let's change this from my click button to my click spy. We rerun this and this will now pass. But another thing I want to show you is something that I think will be make this even more, it's a little magical. So it's not on by default, but we had this idea of auto outputs spies, auto spy outputs, sorry, auto spy outputs. And so the idea of this is when we're mounting our component, we don't even need to declare what, we don't even need to give it a component property, a spy or anything like that. All we need to do is tell auto spy outputs to be true. And what it does is under the covers, the button component, it's going to mount, our mount function is going to look at this class, this component class, and check for any properties that are of type event emitter. And then it's going to assume that, yes, you want to automatically create a spy for that thing. So by turning this on to true, what it will do is it will actually look for the button. It's going to take this property name of clicked, and it's going to set a spy for it. So if we run this, it will fail, and I'll show you why. But because what it uses is it uses the property name syntax. So I think it was clicked. So if we change this to clicked, and then it adds a camel case spy at the end. So if we run this, now it passes. So here you can see this is even less code to get this to work. And so but I want to show you now is how you can interact with the custom mount function finally. Which then if say you wanted this behavior by default and you didn't want to have to keep passing this true flag in, I want to show you how you guys can do something like this as well. So let's go ahead and remove this, run this test, and it will fail because again, we didn't tell it to do this. But if we go to Cypress, let's go to support and our component support file, we see we're importing our mount function and we're basically returning it. We're not doing anything extra. So instead, let's say we're going to pass it a component of, this is the actual syntax of it is, and we're going to give it a config, and it's a mount config of type T as well. So this is, and we're going to return, I think I need to, And I need to import this from Angular Core. From Angular Core, and this is this is when we add TypeScript to this, and then this returns a mount response of T. So this is how we can basically configure our mount support function. And so instead of passing mount, we now want to give it a component of type, and here we're going to have to tell it that it's unknown, and a config of mount config of unknown. And here we're going to return, and here's where we're going to call our mount function, and we're going to give it the component we pass it, and we're going to here, we want to spread the config. So any other config options that we give it, we want those to go in, and then we want to turn on auto spy outputs to true. So in this case, if we now rerun this test, this will probably yell at us because that test now conflicts. But if we auto spy outputs true, config here, and we go to this test, let's do dot only. And now this test passed, even though it was failing before, because our mount function is actually, the side.mount is actually taking what we're passing it, in this case is nothing, and it's configuring this to be exactly what you want. You could also add, if you had like a shared module, something like that, you could add anything you wanted to these mount commands. But I think it's really helpful to know how to configure these mount commands so that it really gives you the ability to improve your DX and kind of make your experience for what your team's custom situation is, makes it really easy for you guys to work with component testing. So I think we have like 10 minutes left, so I'll probably stop here and answer any questions you guys have. Let's see. Do we have any questions? Q&A. How can I determine that the site I want to take the test on needs Cypress? To take the test on needs Cypress. I mean, there are sites written in certain programming languages that we can't test with Cypress. So I think I understand what you're asking, Kareem. But Cypress, if you're doing end-to-end testing, it doesn't care what framework, what language, how you compiled your code. It just visits a URL. You could do it to google.com. Anything that can run in a browser, Cypress can test for end-to-end testing. Component testing is different because it's specific to the framework. And the reason why is when you do end-to-end testing, especially locally, it relies upon, well, no matter how you're doing it, but it relies upon a dev server already basically serving your assets to your website, and then you're testing that website. So that's why if you do end-to-end testing, you have to serve your app, and then you also, on like another tab or another terminal window, you have to then run Cypress. With component testing, that's not the case because component testing actually, when you just run Cypress and it mounts the component in a dev server that ships with Cypress. And so for component testing, it should work for any of the frameworks that I showed in that drop down when we were installing it. But for like end-to-end testing, it should work for pretty much any browser. Looks like Sean has a question. If component testing is written by devs and designers, how would the QA team benefit from it? So one of the benefits I would say from a QA team is that it's not going to be as beneficial in the sense of like you're not necessarily writing the test. Not that you couldn't write the test, but the benefit is hopefully things that are like isolated bugs hopefully will get caught by developers so that you wouldn't have to necessarily hopefully catch or fix later down the line. And that's the idea of shifting left, is that component testing moves uh, testing further to the left and sooner in the process. So hopefully the idea is that it would catch problems before it gets to QA in that scenario. But the other thing is, like, the good thing about component testing is, again, it's built more for developers. But in the end, I think the important thing is to think about it as your whole team. Like, what are the benefits of the entire of your team, not just your specific role or just QA or just designers or developers, something like that. But just think about like just think about it as holistically, I guess. So, but it is a good point that this tool, component testing as a tool, is more tailored for developers than it is QA people. Look like we have another question. I have a question too. Should we finish the unit test first before we start to perform the component test? So one thing that I would say is one thing I think is important to write is component testing doesn't replace unit testing, but in a lot of instances it does. So it doesn't completely remove it, but because your application is still going to have maybe like some type of state store, or there's going to be services or things that are not components that you want to like test the core functionality, whether it be a function, or if it's like you're using Redux, you want to test that, your state gets updated correctly. So there's going to be individual methods, functions, things like that you're still going to want to write unit tests for. But component testing, I would say, is when you're writing components, you shouldn't be putting business logic in your components to begin with. So if you're doing a lot of unit testing in a component, it's really a good it's a code smell that you should be putting that logic somewhere else from an architectural standpoint. And so component testing is really meant to mimic the way a user interacts with it. So though you're mounting the component from the standpoint of a developer, you want to test and interact with sort of like the side effects, or like the way a user would, which would just be in a browser. So you're not caring about if you click a button, if it calls a method that does some logic. You don't want to test the logic in that method with component testing. You want to test that the effects from the browser, from a user standpoint, those behave as expected. So in most cases, unit tests or component testing will replace unit tests that are specifically for a component. And if your component requires a lot of unit testing to begin with, it's really a bigger smell in general. But again, you're still going to want to have unit testing as a whole, because there's going to be things that aren't components in your application that you still want to test those. Let's see. Okay, I think that answers that question, hopefully. Is there any other questions? I know we're almost at time.
Yep, I think that's all. Do we have anything on the general? Sometimes there are questions. I think they've been already answered. Yep, that's
Perfect.
all for the questions and answer session.
Yes. So, and the time almost come to end. And once again, I'm really appreciate a wise word for Jordan, and also the Emily who support for host, and Chathuranga as well, and the attendees as well. So we will share the record as we can. And also don't forget to join to the Discord server, official Discord server in the Cypress, and you can get the answers, and you can contact the organizers, and also you can contact the ambassadors as well as using the Discord server. And also in our region, we have a Facebook group especially for the Sri Lanka and India. So please share the recordings and share the post as well. And you can get the answers by directly by us or as the Cypress team. And thank you very much for everyone. And we will meet another session soon.
Yes,
Bye bye.
thank you very much, everyone, and thanks, Jordan, a lot for your time and your contribution. And Emily, thanks a lot for helping us to organize this. And all the attendees, thank you for your questions. And I hope each and every one of you got the doubts and the points that were in your mind. So we will be sharing, as Lasitha mentioned, the recording on the Discord and our Facebook group. So looking forward to meet you all on another session. Thank you very much and have a nice evening.
Thank you guys.